Hey! Okay, so in case I didn't, or you didn't get a chance to meet me when I joined your Zoom live stream not last week before spring break, I'm gonna be your sub for, I'm covering for Mr. Wang for the next few weeks. You can call me Miss Reyes or Miss Kiana or something, whatever, as long as it's not disrespectful or something. I know it's kind of hard to get to know you when it's like virtual school like this, but I'm gonna try the best capacity that I can to get to know you and hopefully let you get to know me as well. And I hope you had a safe spring break. I know it wasn't much of a change from what you've kind of been doing, but hopefully you found something fun to do inside. Yeah, okay, so we're going to be kicking off a new, your last unit for the year. It's an ecology unit, and the way the trajectory of this unit is going to go, we're going to kind of start pretty like macro scale, like the big picture, and then kind of keep zooming in further and further. So today is going to be an overview to ecology, and we're going to be focusing on the biosphere and kind of understanding things on a big picture, kind of global perspective. And set up PowerPoint. Okay. Sorry, I hadn't gotten the PowerPoint up yet. Okay. Right, ecology. This is chapter 50. Okay, so ecology is defined as the study of interactions between organisms and their environment. And when we're talking about the environment, there are two main categories of factors. You have your abiotic factors. A means non, and then bio means living. So these are your non-living factors. And this would be like sunlight, weather, climate, water, nutrients, wind, and stuff like that. And then you also have your biotic factors, which are your living factors, the living components of the environment. And these biotic factors are important because, species compete with each other for food and other resources and mates if they're the same species. But even if they're not the same species, just organisms of different species, you still compete for resources and land and food and stuff like that. And these biotic factors, like plants and animals, they actually can end up changing the physical environment. And actually, a lot of when you think about like our food and like what we eat, a lot of it actually depends on biotic factors, because whether we're pretty much everything that I can think of that I eat, it either was an animal or a plant, or it came from a plant eventually, right? So biotic factors are actually really important to our survival as well. Okay, so this is kind of going through like the different levels of ecology. So at the very top, this is the smallest unit, the organism. It's just like one individual, right? And then a population is going to be a group of organisms that are the same species living in the same area. So that might be like a group of red kangaroos, right? Or a group of, I don't know, golden retrievers, or, but it's like the same species. And then at the community level, you have organisms of multiple species that are living together in the same area. So then, let's say in a particular environment, you have frogs and snakes. So they're different species and they're living in the same area. And then when you're studying a community, you want to look at how are these different species interacting with each other? Like, do they compete for resources, or is one species a predator and the other species a prey, or is a species causing disease or something like that? So an ecosystem is so far up until this point, organisms, populations, and communities, these are all living creatures or living species. And the ecosystem combines your living species, which are your biotic factors, with your abiotic factors, so the climate, the water, the sunlight, the nutrients. And at the ecosystem level, then you really start exploring how does energy and how do nutrients flow throughout the ecosystem from abiotic factors into biotic factors. How do nutrients get passed around from the like the ground or the air and back into plants and animals? Okay, so this is kind of a picture that's showing like these different levels. At the bottom left-hand corner, you have like the individual, and the levels keep moving up and bigger and bigger. And then you have the next level out from the ecosystem is the biome, and biomes are they're sort of characterized by climate and like a particular location in the world. So like an example would be a desert, which is characterized by a certain climate, certain temperature and rainfall. Or rainforest is another biome, or coral reefs or something like that. And at the very top we have the biosphere. So bio means living or life, and then sphere is a ball. So this is the Earth. And so the biosphere is all the places organisms are going to occupy. This includes your land. The lithosphere is the land. Hydrosphere is the water. Atmosphere is the air. And then at the biosphere level, you're kind of looking at, you're kind of studying interactions on a global scale. Like global abiotic factors, global climate, and stuff like that, and how does that affect species and where they live and things like that. Okay, so one of the big questions that ecologists seek to answer when they're studying different species is, why does a certain species live in a certain area and not in a different area? Or why doesn't this species live everywhere? Because not every species is going to live everywhere, right? And there are many reasons why a certain species might only stay in a certain spot, and it might not, live everywhere. But one of the really important factors that play into where a species does habitat, where a species lives, is the climate. And so we're going to spend some time talking about climate kind of on a global scale, but also on a little bit of a regional scale, and the factors that shape climate around the world. So it all starts with the sun. So the sun's radiation is the primary source, really the only source of energy that's coming into the planet. And really, like, not all of the sun's radiation is being absorbed into the Earth anyway, because some gets absorbed by the clouds and then reflected back, and then some gets reflected from the Earth and whatnot. So anyway, you have some sunlight radiation that is getting absorbed by the Earth and reaching the Earth. But because the Earth is in the shape of a ball, where's that picture? Okay, there it is. Okay, so you see how the Earth is shaped as a sphere. You know that. So when sunlight is hitting the Earth, it doesn't always hit all surfaces of the Earth directly, right? So if you imagine the sun is exactly to the left of the Earth in this picture, the sun's radiation that is going to hit the area around the equator like directly. It's kind of like a perpendicular angle, right? So it's more of a direct contact of sunlight. Whereas if you go higher up the Earth towards higher latitudes, towards like the North Pole or something, the Earth's surface is not directly facing the sun, and so the sunlight that is hitting that area of the Earth, it gets spread out. Like the sun radiation gets distributed over a larger area of the Earth, and so this results in uneven heating along the surface of the Earth. So like, what you see these two orange squares on the Earth, The equator is not necessarily getting like more sunlight. It's just that the sunlight is more concentrated at the equator, and then the sunlight is more dispersed higher up, like towards the North Pole, as you get higher or lower towards the South Pole. So you have some uneven solar heating just due to the shape of the Earth, but additionally, you know that this Earth is tilted on an axis as it rotates and spins around the sun. And this tilt is responsible for why we have seasons. So this adds even more variation in the amount of sunlight that is hitting any particular point of the Earth. So the equator is going to receive the most constant radiation, right? Because not only is it getting it gets more the sunlight radiation is more concentrated over a smaller area of Earth's surface, but also the equator does not have as much variability in seasons as, let's say, the North or South Pole. The North or South Pole sees a much more dramatic change with the seasons. The equator, not so much. Okay, so you have this uneven heating on the surface of the Earth, and this is going to cause air circulation, which is how we're going to get wind later. So what's happening is that, let's say at the equator, the sunlight is warming up the area around the equator, and so the air around the equator is really warm. And additionally, because of all that sun radiation, the water around that area is evaporating more, and so you have water vapor going into the air. So you have warm, wet air now over the equator. That warm air is going to rise because heat rises. And then as it rises, that air is going to cool down. And when it gets high enough, at a high enough altitude, the cool air is going to release the moisture that was in the air, and then it's going to precipitate back down to the earth as rain or something. And then, now that the air is cool and dry, it's going to sink back down because cooler air sinks, it's heavier, and it's going to sink back down as dry air this time because it just lost all its moisture. And if you can see from this diagram that has kind of the latitude degrees labeled, so you have a lot of precipitation as rain coming down on the equator, which are known as the tropics. And so you often see a lot of rainforests at the equator latitude. And you see that the dry, cool air, it's coming down on around 30 degrees latitude north and south of the equator. And that's, I'll let you think about that for a little bit. What kind of biome you imagine would be most likely to be found at 30 degrees latitude north and south if you have like dry air in that area. Okay, so this heating and then cooling and then sinking, and then it heats up again and rises and then cools and sinks again. This creates a sort of a current, a convection current. And so you have these sort of convection currents that are along the different latitudes of the Earth. I'm not entirely sure why this slide is here, but we're going to skip it for now. Okay, so that's how air starts to circulate around the Earth due to this heating and rising and cooling and then sinking. But also, different landforms can also contribute to variations in climate by that concept of air rising and cooling and then sinking and then being dry and stuff like that. So here we're looking at a mountain in California, as it turns out. This is Sierra Nevada's range. So as air is coming in from the ocean, if you're following this diagram, and it's going to start making its way to pass over the mountain. So as the air is going to rise, it's going to cool, right? And as it cools, the moisture that was in the air starts to condense, and then you have precipitation that falls on what is called the windward side of the mountain. So then you get more rainfall on one side of the mountain, and then if you recall from this picture, after it rises and it cools, then it's going to come back down as dry air. So if we go back to our mountain. Okay, so after it passes over the mountain, it's going to be dry air. So then it's common that you see on one side of the mountain you might get rainfall and like trees are growing and whatnot, but then on the other side of the mountain it's a different climate because it's dry, the air is dry, and then it's more of a desert. So that's like one way that a mountain range can cause a difference in climate regionally from one side of the mountain to the other. Another thing, another factor that can affect like climate regionally is just being near bodies of water, because land doesn't land will get warmer faster than water, and land will also release heat faster than water, and so you get a kind of gradient or a difference in temperature. And so as an example, with these two pictures of land next to a body of water, I'm going to start with the bottom picture. So the bottom picture of the land next to the water. So the land is going to get heated up first because land absorbs heat faster than water. So the air above the land is going to be warm, and then that warm air is going to rise because heat rises. And so as that warm air rises, you get it's going to create a difference in pressure, and then cool air from the ocean is going to come in to replace the air that just left because it rose from the land. And so then you're going to get sort of like a convection current that helps to cool down the land, right? And so that's why when you live near a body of water like we do, we live next to the bay and kind of by the ocean as well, then being near a body of water, it kind of helps to temper the climate so that it doesn't really get too hot. It also doesn't get too cold because the picture right above the bottom picture, so this is like the middle picture, it works in reverse. So the land is going to cool down quicker than the ocean. So at night, the water is going to still be warm, and the water will stay warmer than the land. And so then the air above the water is going to rise because heat rises, and then cool air from the land is going to come in to replace the land that had just risen from above the water. So that helps to keep the land warmer than it would be if it wasn't next to a body of water. So kind of being near water, it acts as a little bit of a temperature buffer, so that the land near it gets neither too hot or too cold. And that's why here in the Bay Area we have such lovely weather. It doesn't really get too hot in the summer. It doesn't really get too frigid at winter. Pretty nice. Okay, so that's how you get your air circulation across the globe. We already talked about how land absorbs heat faster. The other thing is that because the Earth is spinning, right? So because the Earth is spinning, and different parts of the globe are spinning faster than other parts. So when you think about the equator is the farthest away from the axis of the Earth, right? Compared to the poles, the North and South Pole, they're the closest to the Earth's axis. So the poles actually spin the slowest, and the equator is going to spin faster than the rest of the Earth's surface because it's furthest away from the Earth's axis. And the Earth spinning and rotating, that's going to kind of cause the air, it would have been cycling in its little convection current, right? Air rising when it's heated and then cooling when it sinks, and that kind of starts to push the air east or west, and that's how you get these wind currents across the globe, and that's what allowed for ships to be traveling across the ocean, because you have air moving west and east. Okay, so we have wind now, and we have air circulation. We also have ocean circulation. So just like there are wind currents, there's also ocean currents, cold currents and warm currents. And these currents are going to be, they help to either cool down or warm up the land that they come in contact with, to help kind of moderate the temperatures of the land that they're near. And they also help to distribute nutrients around, because they're moving and mixing the water around, so that nutrients that are in one area of the ocean, they get to other areas. So it helps to just distribute up the nutrients. Yeah, and all this contributes. So your sunlight, your air circulation, wind, and water, ocean circulation, those all help contribute to what a climate will be in a certain area of the world. Okay, so now that we have an understanding of kind of like how climate works on a large scale, we can start talking about different biomes. A biome is going to be characterized, by its climate, because certain biomes are really only going to only going to exist in certain climates. We're going to start with aquatic biomes first. So we'll start with on water, and then we're going to move to land. So we'll do land at the end. Okay, so aquatic biomes, they're super important because they are, majority of the Earth's surface is water. 75% of the surface is ocean, and so just by the sheer volume of the size of the biome, the oceans actually provide a lot of oxygen for our planet, just because there's so much of the ocean, and so you have the algae and the photosynthetic bacteria in the ocean, providing oxygen to us by way of photosynthesis. And I don't know if this class has gone through the water cycle yet. I think that might be later. But anyway, due to the water cycle, which where the sun's radiation is causing water to evaporate from the ocean, and then it turns into a cloud, and then the cloud eventually rains, and that's how you get our rainfall. So the oceans are responsible for rainfall for the land biomes on the rest of the planet. So super important. And then you have your freshwater biomes. They're important too, because we drink fresh water, and freshwater is going to have about 1% salt concentration, whereas the marine biomes are going to have about 3% salt concentrations. And as you can see from this map, it's not just ocean and freshwater. There are quite a few aquatic biomes that have their own unique attributes and traits, and they have their own functions. Okay, so a little bit of just kind of some terminology about aquatic environments. So picture on the left is a lake, picture on the right is ocean, and they're pretty similar in how you label them, just a little bit different. We got some extra parts for our ocean picture. So if you can see in either photo, there's a part of the water that's it looks a little clearer or lighter, and that part of the water that's lighter or clearer is on the top, and so that's called the photic zone, and it's where photosynthesis is mainly happening, because the sunlight, it can only penetrate so far into the water, and at some point you don't get any more light. So obviously photosynthesis needs light to happen, and so photosynthesis is only going to be happening in kind of a zone that's near the top of the water. Benthic zone. Benthic is going to be basically the floor of the body of water. So either the floor, like the ground of the lake, or the ocean floor. And so at some point, when the benthic zone when the floor of the lake or ocean is below the photic zone, like you can't have photosynthesis happening there. And so the organisms that live in the benthic zone, they mainly rely on dead organic matter called detritus falling from, above. And that's how they get their nutrients. And then the other important characteristic about aquatic environments is there's in ocean water and usually in lakes there's usually something called a thermocline, and that's this very sharp drop in temperature. It's almost like a little bit of a temperature boundary between the photic zone and the aphotic zone. So the part of the water that has sunlight in it and then the part of the water where sunlight doesn't really penetrate. So you have a sharp drop in temperature, and that's called a thermocline. Okay, so we're going to start to go through some of the, just kind of introduce you to some of the biomes, water biomes. So these first three, intertidal zones, estuaries, and mangroves, also known as wetlands, these three, a kind of unifying characteristic about these three types of biomes is that their environment is pretty unstable. There's a lot of change happening a lot. Either changes in temperature, changes in oxygen, changes in salt concentration. So we'll start with intertidal zones, which is top picture where the starfish is. So intertidal zone sounds exactly like what it is, or it sounds exactly like its name. It's the part where the tide is coming in and out. And so there's a lot of change happening all the time just because, the organisms that live there, sometimes there's water over them and then sometimes there's not. So you get change in temperature, change in salt concentration, because sometimes the ocean salt water is over you and sometimes it's not. And then you get, frequent air exposure all the time. So the organisms that live here have to be really specially adapted to be handling that kind of change. And also just the nature of the tide coming in and out. There's a lot of mechanical pressure of just the waves crashing in and pushing and pulling. And so the animals have to, or plants and animals, they have to have certain adaptations to help them hang on to their habitat so that they don't get pushed around by the water. So like a starfish, for example, it's got sticky feet so it can hang on to wherever it plants itself. Estuaries are kind of they are transition juncture between a river and the sea. So fresh water meets salt water. And so what happens at estuaries, you've got the salt water coming in from the sea and then fresh water from the river. And salt, they have different densities. So salt water tends to be on the bottom of the estuary, and the fresh water, the nutrients from the river, tends to be on the top. So then within an estuary, you have like different stratifications of salt content. So organisms, plants, and animals that live there, they have to be able to adapt to changes in salt content, especially when you have the ocean tide going in and out, and so you have salt water that's kind of flowing up the estuary channel or flowing back out, and so changes in salt concentration. Some plants can't handle that, and so the plants that do live in estuaries have to be able to handle that kind of change in mineral content. And then mangroves, wetlands. Bay Area is a wetland, or wetland is part of our is a biome that we have near us. And wetlands are super cool because not only are they super productive biome, a lot of photosynthesis happening and whatnot, wetlands also act kind of like a water filter. They help to filter out nutrients and pollutants in the water, and they also act kind of as a protection against flooding and stuff like that, because wetlands are kind of like they're kind of where water is going to meet the coast. Some body of water is meeting the land or the beach or whatever. So wetlands, a very healthy functioning wetland, it kind of acts as a little bit of a buffer between any flooding or waves or tides or stuff like that. And so they're really cool too. And wetlands are one of the most productive biomes out there, meaning that there's a lot of photosynthesis happening, and the photosynthetic organisms there produce a lot of biomass for per area of the biome. Okay, so oceans. Oceans are important because well, they provide our rainfall, and therefore they allow us to have water to drink and everything. And also because there's so much of the ocean covering the Earth's surface, you get a lot of photosynthetic activity happening from the photosynthetic bacteria and organisms that live on the surface of the ocean, and so you get a lot of oxygen just from the ocean. And oceans also help to act as a carbon dioxide sink for us. And a really important thing that happens in the oceans is something called upwelling. And if you kind of follow the blue arrows in this diagram, you see that the water at the bottom is kind of like coming up and then circling around. And so upwelling, what it does is it's kind of like a mixing of the waters. And this is important because it helps to mix nutrients around so that areas of the water that were maybe not as nutrient rich, they can get some nutrients so that the organisms that are in that area can, have food and do photosynthesis and stuff like that to support the food webs in that area. That's exactly what I said. So your nutrient-rich water is moving around, and this happens seasonally in lakes. It's called turnover. And I know that text starts with spring, but I wanted to start with winter. So in the winter, which is the top left picture, you have so let's say the lake freezes over, right? So you have a frozen, you have ice on the surface of the lake. It's going to be considered oligotrophic, which oligo means few, trophic means feeding, I think. And so the lake in winter is going to be considered nutrient poor, few nutrients. Nutrient poor and oxygen rich is the characteristic of an oligotrophic lake. And since it's nutrient poor, there's very little photosynthesis happening, and then there's very little decomposition happening. But then in the spring, when the ice over the lake melts, then that cold water that's now on the surface of the lake, cold water is going to sink because it's heavier, and cold sinks. So it's going to mix the water in the lake around, and that's how you're going to mix the nutrients and oxygen around, so that all through the depths of the lake, you have equal amounts of oxygen and nutrients. And then in the summer, the lake is considered eutrophic, which means nutrient rich. And so the lake in the summer is characterized as being nutrient rich, oxygen poor, because there's a lot of nutrients. You got a lot of photosynthesis happening and a lot of decomposition happening, so it's thriving. But then in the autumn, the air, the temperature starts cooling down, and then you have a turnover again where the cooler surface water is going to sink, and then it's going to mix the water again, so that you mix your nutrients and your oxygen. So through the depths of the lake, you have an even distribution of oxygen and nutrients. And this is important so that you just make sure that you're mixing around nutrients so that organisms that live at different levels of the body of water can get the nutrients they need to sustain themselves and sustain the food chains that they're a part of. Okay, so these are more examples of more pictures of aquatic biomes. I'm just going to briefly talk about the one picture that's front and center, which is a coral reef. And coral reefs, they they're a really cool, diverse biome, and they live along coasts in the kind of tropical area, tropical latitude area, and they need kind of warm water, and they also need to be kind of like towards the surface of the water because they need high water clarity and a lot of light. And what's cool about coral reefs, aside from they're highly diverse, they're one of the most diverse biomes. They also serve as a kind of protection. They're kind of like a natural barrier to flooding or damage that would have happened from water, tides and stuff like that. So coral reefs are kind of like a natural protection for the coasts that they are lining, and so that's why they're important. And they're not just pretty and fun tourist attractions. They're also like very helpful natural barriers that protect humans living their lives near them. Okay, so we're gonna move on from water to land now. Terrestrial biomes, land biomes. Again, biomes, they're different regions, and they're going to be characterized by climate. So they're characterized by temperature and rainfall, stuff like that. And as you can see from this map, there's actually quite a lot of different land biomes. And this is a picture. This graph is called a climate graph, and what it does is it helps to show the range of a biome's temperature and rainfall. So what you do is, like, over the course of a year, you kind of plot, like, okay, what's the range of different temperatures that you get over the year, and the range of different rainfall amounts that you get in the course of a year, and then you kind of plot out, you shade in and all the area that it takes up on the graph. So why this is useful is it kind of shows you how the different biomes are differ from each other in terms of temperature and rainfall. You can see that the tropical rainforest, which is kind of like the green snake looking thing at the top of the graph, it has a pretty stable temperature throughout the year, but it has massive changes in rainfall. It gets a lot of precipitation. Whereas the desert, which is kind of like the yellow banana slug looking thing on the left of the graph, it doesn't really get much precipitation, pretty constant low amount of precipitation, but it varies in temperature throughout the year. And so you see that there is some overlap, but you kind of can get a better idea of the distinctions and boundaries between the different biomes through a graph like this. Okay, so we're going to start with the desert. Desert, very, very low amount of rainfall, less than 10 centimeters. Annual rainfall is actually what kind of categorizes a desert. And you have a high amount of evaporation, so because of all the heat and dryness of the air, and very low biodiversity, just because there's not everyone is adapted to living in such an extreme, dry, arid environment. And if you remember way back when we were talking about climate and air circulation, and I said that the air that rises, that gets heated up at the equator, and the air rises and then it cools and then sinks back down as dry air, and that dry air tends to land about 30 degrees north and south of the equator. So that's where you find most of your deserts, at 30 degrees north and south, because you have all that dry air now, and deserts are dry places. Yep, arid. Arid is another word for dry. Okay. So it's kind of a map showing deserts across the globe. You see a lot of them, especially in Africa, kind of around that 30-degree mark, and then more deserts at the 30 degrees south of the equator. Okay, so to live in such a harsh environment, plants and animals, they have to have certain adaptations that help them, especially survive. So plants, they're going to have a slow metabolism so that they don't use up their energy too quickly. Fleshy tissue that kind of helps to retain more moisture, retain the water that it stores up. Shallow roots, thick cuticle. What we mean by thick cuticle is that basically the plant leaves are not as porous, so that water is not going to evaporate or transpire. Transpiration is the formal word for evaporating from plants. So not as much water is going to be sweating from the plant, basically, because plants don't want to give up any of their precious water resources. Animals have certain adaptations as well. A lot of them will be nocturnal, so that they do most of their living at nighttime, like their eating and hunting and whatnot would be at nighttime where it's cooler, so they don't have to go out during the day and risk, getting too hot or sweating and losing water and stuff like that. And a lot of animals, since there's not a lot of water around to be drinking, they have to be able to get their water from their food. And like the food we eat does contain some amount of water, but I don't know about you, but I don't think I could just rely on eating to just get my water content. I would get pretty thirsty. But animals in the desert, they have to live like that, so they are specially adapted to have that kind of lifestyle. And there you go, a little hare that lives in the desert. Okay, dry shrublands. These are also called a chaparral biome. The semi-arid regions, kind of dry. You got some wet winters, dry summers. And what's unique about this region is that the plants tend to be, they need to have adaptations that allow them to be drought tolerant and fire tolerant. What state does drought and fire remind you of? Our state, California. So California is in the chaparral biome, and the plants around us, they kind of have to be drought and fire resistant, tolerant. So we do have fires in California is pretty regular part of our seasonality. Okay, so next we're going to talk about grasslands. Grasslands and the savanna, they're pretty similar looking biomes. Grasslands, think the Midwest of America, where all your farms are and stuff like that. So grasslands are kind of grasslands and savannas. They're both like a middle ground between like a desert and some kind of forest. The difference is that savannas, they tend to have more rainfall. It's a bit of a wetter biome, so they're more of an intermediate between deserts and a tropical rainforest, whereas grasslands are kind of like in between the deserts and a regular temperate forest. So the savanna, you think Africa, Lion King, that kind of vibe, whereas grasslands, you got like bison and stuff like that, and like, I don't know, North Dakota, South Dakota, something like that. Soil tends to be pretty rich, and then you got a lot of grazers that graze on the grass. Okay, your forests. We're going to talk about 3 different forests, and we're going to go from most amount of rainfall to least amount of rainfall. So your tropical rainforests, they get the most amount of rainfall of the 3 forest types that we're going to talk about, and the rainforests, they're going to be occurring around, the equator latitude. And actually, as we go through these 3 forests, you'll notice that they kind of go, they get colder in climate and higher in latitude or altitude, either. So rainforests, super high biodiversity, high productivity, very diverse and very productive biome. And you'll notice that it says no litter or soil. This isn't like trash litter or anything. It's more of like leaf litter, plant litter, and poor soil. And it might sound like a little confusing, but what's happening is that because the rainforest biome is so productive. Any nutrients that would go into the soil from after like decomposition or whatever, it gets taken up like really fast. The turnover rate is so fast that you really don't find too much nutrients in the soil, since it's considered poor. So moving on to the temperate forests, these would be like your forests in the East Coast, let's say. You get a little bit less rainfall, a little bit colder in climate, and the real big difference between temperate forests and then the last forest that we're going to talk about, which is boreal forests, is that temperate forests, they lose their leaves. So they look like how you'd expect trees to look like in the fall, with different colors, and then they lose their leaves in the winter. So last forest, boreal forest, also called the taiga. Very little precipitation. It's colder, so you're either higher in latitude or higher in altitude. So think either Canada or Lake Tahoe, somewhere high in the mountains, or high towards the poles or something. The trees that are here are your evergreen trees, called so because they stay green forever. So these are like your Christmas trees, your pine trees, and the trees here, they have to be adapted to cold temperatures. So your pine needles, they are adapted to freezing, so they're not going to flip out when snow falls on them and stays on the tree for like months or whatever through the winter season. Okay, and then the last biome, second to last biome that we're going to talk about is tundra. Tundra is the coldest biome. Very low temperatures, low precipitation, pretty poor soil, just because like there's not a lot of, there's not that much diversity going on, and so very little decomposition is happening, and so you don't have as much nutrients cycling around. Short growth periods. As if you recall me saying that as you get higher to the poles, North and South Pole, which is where the tundra exists, they get really large variation in seasons. So there are times of the year where you get some sunlight, and times of the year where you're pretty much getting no sunlight. And so that's what it means by a short growth period. There's a limited amount of time in the year that there's sunlight and that things can grow. So your plants that are growing here or existing here, they have to be really hardy plants that are specially adapted to be living in such a harsh environment. Especially because the tundra has a layer called permafrost, which is like a frozen layer that's under the soil. So plants, you normally have pretty small plants because the roots can't be going too deep. They're pretty shallow roots. So a shallow root system can really only support a plant that's not too big or too tall. Okay, last biome is streams. Thing about streams is streams, they're you'll have different characteristics of streams based on where it is in its latitude or altitude, how much rainfall it's getting, and or snow or something, and that will affect what the stream is like and its diversity. And there's three inside the stream. There's three kind of like mini habitats that I wanted to point out, and that's the riffle, the pool, and the run. So I'm going to start with the pool. The pool in a stream is an area that is deep and the water is moving very slowly. And so the characters, what this might mean in terms of like a characteristic of that area is because the water is moving slowly, the water's not getting aerated as much, so you might have lower oxygen there. But then because it's moving slowly, maybe it can support different organisms that can't handle like fast-moving water. A riffle is a shallower area of the pool. It usually has rocks in it, and the water's moving very turbulently because of the rocks. And because the water's moving very turbulently, you get more oxygen in it. And a run is kind of like a Goldilocks area of the pool of the stream, where the water is moving pretty moderately, not too fast, and pretty smoothly, and so your water tends to be very clear at a run area. So that's just an example of different habitats in the stream that can support different kind of like these micro ecosystems. They support different organisms that are better adapted to live in, you know, maybe slower moving water or faster moving water or something like that. Okay, is that it? Oh, okay, that was it. Okay, oh, we made it. I've never talked for so long in my entire life. Okay, so that's it for today. I think next lecture is going to be kind of looking at more of looking at ecosystems and understanding going from the biosphere to to how ecosystems work. Okay, I'm going to try to stop this now before it gets too long. So I will see you next lecture or Thursday, whichever comes first. Okay, have a nice Tuesday or whenever you are watching this. Okay, bye.